Friends, good evening to the 8th-day evening session with Professor Ram Punyani from Mumbai. Professor Ram Punyani, a warm welcome to you from the over 182 participants of this 21-day online course on human rights.
Thank you, Henry. Thank you very much. Pleased to be with you.
Thank you. A few words of introduction. The detailed CV is going to be shared with you.
Yeah.
It's important for participants, all of you, to know that Professor has taken voluntary retirement from the Indian Institute of Technology in Mumbai. And the reason he did so in 2004 was to work full-time for communal harmony and human rights. Here is among us a professor who has taken voluntary retirement to protect communal harmony in this country and human rights in this country. He has been working for communal harmony, human rights, national integration by delivering a number of lectures, conducting workshops for different urban and rural groups, creating and disseminating popular literature far and wide, bringing out small booklets in different languages for the need for communal harmony, also participating in investigation of violations of human rights of minorities in particular, advocacy work with the government for creating an atmosphere conducive to communal amity, participation in meetings of social groups engaged in upholding plural values to strengthen the plural ethos of our society. He participates in a number of citizens' inquiry committees, has been the recipient of several prestigious awards and appreciations, and has been continuously engaged with matters relating to communal harmony. Now, he also is a member of the curriculum committee of the course on communal harmony by the Tata Institute of Social Sciences, Mumbai, which you have been introduced to earlier. He is a member of the curriculum committee developing a syllabus for communal harmony course at the Nirmala Niketan, Mumbai. I'm sure many of the institutions present here will now envy one another, inviting him to be on your curriculum committee for developing a special course in your respective institutions. He is a visiting fellow at the Madurai Kamaraj University and a member of the National Academic Planning Committee for the Indian Social Science Congress. Besides all this, he's a lovable person. He's a very, very close friend of ours, has visited Madurai several times, and I am sure in the course of this conversation, he will tell you where his books are available, because these are lovely books which everyone here would love to have in their hands. They are very, very cheaply priced, but extremely valuable. I will now request Professor Punyani to go ahead on the topic of religious minorities have human rights.
Thank you, Henry, for this generous introduction, and good evening, friends. I'm very glad that you are participating in a course on human rights, and my topic has generally been the marginalized sections of society and religious minorities in particular. Really, when we say minorities, first thing, let me be clear that minorities are not just religious minorities. They can be linguistic minorities, they can be ethnic minorities, they can be minorities with sexual orientation, etc., etc. But why in India we talk about religious minorities is mainly it is around these minorities that the Indian politics has been structured by the communal forces. And of course, I will give a brief outline of how in particular Muslims have been the main minority, and Christians have also been roped in for being targeted from the decade of 1990s. Next slide, please. Now, as far as minorities, as I said, one is Muslims, second is Christians, and to begin with, I'll just say the type of plight which they are having. Recently, we had Corona epidemic, and taking advantage of that, the communal forces and its mouthpiece, a large section of lap media, which many people call as Godi media, tried to impute all the blame on the Muslim community, Tablighi Jamaat. Later on, they were boycotted. Many of them were boycotted to enter into certain areas, and they were prevented from selling their wares. And the call was also given that Muslims should be boycotted. Now, as such, if we see majority of Muslims in India, not only that they are religious minorities, but they also come from the poorer sections of Indian society, that is, the large converts to Islam have been from the Dalits in India. And contrary to the popular perception that Muslim kings brought Islam to India, let me tell you that it was Arab traders in Malabar coast on 8th century when Islam entered through trade and interaction between Arab traders and the local people. And incidentally, I'll tell you that there are a lot of these Muslim communities who have very similar culture, similar traditions to the local people, and two great examples are Malabar in Kerala and
Hello.
Mewat in Rajasthan, and some particular traditions in Bengal. Now, why did, contrary to the popular perception that Muslim kings, they use the sword to spread Islam? Let me tell you, Swami Vivekananda in his collected works tells us that it is wrong to say that Islam spread on the strength of the sword. The untouchables, the Dalits, they embraced Islam to escape the social tyranny, the caste system, the Varna system. And majority of the conversions took place not because of the king, but because of the Sufi saints. Please note here that Sufi saints and Bhakti saints, these are on the one side who are generally with the people, while the clergy, it may be Pope or at that time Rajgurus or the Brahmins or the Maulanas, they have generally stood with the landlords, with the kings, while Sufi and Bhakti saints, they were with the poor people. Now here also I must point out that kings generally spread their power, while of course religion was spread by different mechanisms, and one king I will say who spread his religion was Emperor Ashok, and it was not done by sword. Next slide, please. Now, so as I pointed out, majority of the Muslims come from the poor background, and if we see the medieval part, which is used a lot for communalization of the society, in medieval India, there were Hindu kingdoms, there were Muslim kingdoms. And the main contradiction, the main source of conflict in the society was not between Hindu and Muslim kings. The main source, social contradiction, was between the poor farmers and the landlords. Landlords were Hindus as well as Muslims. And of course, I must say what dominates our view is that the North India, the Mughal kings, but of course, there is a long history to that. So while kings were aligned to each other, they were also fighting with each other. Just two examples I'll give you. You'll remember Akbar's Navratnas, 9 jewels of Akbar. In his 9 jewels were his topmost officers, Birbal and Raja Todarmal were important component. In Hindu kingdoms also you see Rana Pratap, his associate was Hakim Khan Sur. You see our Shivaji from Maharashtra, he had a lot of Muslim officers, and one of the major officer was Maulana Hyder Ali. 12 of his generals were also Muslims. So the power was not along the Hindu-Muslim line. This I will elaborate in some other places. You can see some of my other YouTube videos on this particular topic. And at popular level, people were interacting with each other. They were interacting not only in the area of literature, food habits, clothes, architecture, poetry, music, but also in the matters of religion. You'll see that the Sufi saints who come from the Islamic tradition, their followers were Hindus also. Even today, you will see many Hindus visiting the Sufi saint shrines, and you will also see that there were many Hindus who were, many Muslims who were following the Hindu Bhakti saints like Kabir, Tukaram, Namdev, and Narsi Mehta. And the festivals were generally a joint celebration. So while today history is being presented as Hindu versus Muslim, the seeds of which were sown by British policy of divide and rule, and the same was picked up by the communal elements, Muslim League on one side, Hindu Mahasabha and RSS on the other side. In contrary to this, Mahatma Gandhi told us that kings were Hindus, kings were Muslims, their subjects were Hindus, their subjects were Muslims, but it was not along religious grounds that kings were making their policies. Same way, Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru goes a step further and tells us that India's major culture had been, now this is a Hindi word from North Indian tradition, and that word is Ganga Jamni Tehzeeb. What does he mean by that? By that he means that Muslims and Hindus, they celebrated jointly in all the spheres of life. I will not give details examples of poetry in praise of Lord Krishna by Rahim Andras Khan, the music by Ustad Bismillah Khan, the food habits which got interacted, the development of a syncretic language between the synthesis of Persian and Avdi Boli called Urdu. But mainly I'll say that the culture did not have boundaries. And please note, only that society progresses where people live with amity and harmony. Next slide, please. Now, so how does this problem of communalism come, and how does this minorities majority concept come? There are two stages. One is the rise of communal politics, and second is the rise of minority oppression after the partition of the country. Now, during colonial period, it is a beginning that communal politics also develops. Colonial period is remarkable in the sense that on one side, it gives to the changes which give to the idea of Indian nationalism. At the same time, it gives rise to the changes because of which the older classes, the declining sections of society, the Raja, Nawab, Zamidar, Jagirdar, the landed gentry, and the kings, they also formed the communal organizations. So how did this happen? Now, British came here primarily in the name of trade. Then after that, they ruled here and they plundered our country. Please remember a wonderful book by Shashi Tharoor called The Dark Era of Empire, where it tells us how India was plundered by the British period to the great extent. I will not go into details of that. Now, in order to plunder the country, in order to rule the country, British brought three major changes. And one was transport, railways, which you'll remember as rail. Second was communication, telephone, telegraph, postal system, which you'll remember as mail. And third was modern education, modern judicial system, and modern punitive system, which you can remember as jail. So just to remember the major changes: rail, mail, and jail. Now, another important thing which must remember, that Indian society starts getting transformed with modern education going to Dalits and women. Always remember Jyotirao Phule and Savitribai Phule, who did this marathon job for the country. Now, so Indian nationalism here emerges from the classes which came up newly during colonial period. What are these new classes? These new classes are: one is a industrialist businessman class, number two, the working class, and number three, the modern educated classes. Now, there was a formation of organizations. These I call as a rising classes: businessmen, industrialists, workers, and the modern educated classes. And from rising classes come up three major trains. This is not the exhaustive list. What are the three major trains? One is that's of likes of Bhagat Singh with Naujawan Bharat Sabha, Ambedkar with Republican Party of India, and Maulana Abul Kalam Azad, Annie Besant, Sardar Baldev Singh, and Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi with Indian National Congress. This I call as a rising classes. Next slide, please. Now, what is happening to the old classes? They're Rajas, Nawabs, landlords, and all this, and they feel a change in the social pattern. Their hegemony over lower sections of society starts decreasing. Their power starts decreasing. And very wonderfully, very cleverly, very deceitfully, they do not say that their power and hegemony is declining. They say that their religion is in danger. So the Muslim section of this, which finally got crystallized as Muslim League, it shouted Islam in danger. And the Hindu section, which began as Hindu Mahasabha, and later on another dangerous organization got added to it called RSS. They both said Hinduism in danger. Please note, friends, religion is not in danger. It is the power of the few who keep shouting that our religion is in danger. Same way, you must have noticed last 6 years, as the human rights are being suppressed, human rights of minorities are being suppressed, the main slogan is that Hinduism is in danger. Now, so basically, Muslim League and Hindu Mahasabha, initially only it was the elite section, upper caste section who were a part of it. Later on, of course, some educated elite, some upper caste section joined them, and they gave leadership to these organizations. Muslim League one hand, you will remember Muhammad Ali Jinnah. Hindu Mahasabha, you will remember Vinayak Damodar Savarkar, and based on Savarkar's ideology and based on slightly deviating, slightly overlapping, the other organization came in 1925, which is the biggest organization, communal organization in the country, called RSS. Next slide, please. Now, of course, this is again a very big topic. I'm not going to go into details. British wanted to play the role of dividing the country because it was in their international interest. Their first interest was that for ruling, they have to divide and rule. Second thing, as they were progressing around the decade of 1930s, 40s, with the rise of Russia, they felt that Russia may take away a big chunk of ideological people from the country. So they wanted to ensure hegemony in this region. So British policy of divide and rule was a central cause of partition of the country. In this, as I pointed out, Muslim League was prompted to demand Pakistan, and Muslim League had mainly the elite sections of society. Of course, later on in the decades of 90s, as communalism appeals to the emotions, some of the middle class sections also joined Muslim League, but its overall representation till 1940 was not more than 10% of the Muslim population. Poor average Muslims, they opposed the demand of Pakistan. They stood with national movement, and even particularly Barelvi and Deoband Maulanas stood solidly with the demand of a composite Indian nationalism, and two great other examples of composite Indian nationalism being supported by the Muslim voice was Maulana Abul Kalam Azad, Khan Abdul Ghaffar Khan, Dr. M.M. Ansari, Zakir Hussain, and all the others. Now, so with partition, a small elite section of Indian Muslims migrated to Pakistan, but the majority Muslims, the average Muslims, the poor Muslims, they stayed here not at the cost of charity or mercy, but as a matter of their right, because the idea of exchange of population was neither realistic nor supported by many of them. Next slide, please. Now, in independent India, of course, as British promoted their policy of divide and rule, they also introduced in books the type of understanding where kings were associated with the religion. Kings are basically associated with power and wealth, but here they associated the kings with their religion, and it is due to this that whole community got identified with that. So the way things came up in the communal historiography promoted by British, there was a lot of hatred for Muslims amongst the mind of section of Hindus, and vice versa. a section of Muslims also started hating section of Hindus, and communal violence began. Now, communal violence in the pre-partition India, in that by and large, the state was neutral, police was neutral. Today, the things are very different, and you cannot say this thing even remotely. Now, after independence, then constantly emotional issues were thrown up, more so from the decade of 1980s. You'll remember Ram Temple, Love Jihad, Ghar Wapsi, cow, beef, and latest in this edition being Corona Jihad, like what these Tablighi Jamaat people did has been called as Corona Jihad by a large section of the media. Now, as such, Muslims are 14.2% of the population according to census figures of 2011. But various estimates tell us that it is over 80% of Muslims who are part of the victims of the communal violence. Now, similarly, so what has happened, just to summarize, during all these years, 70 years of independence, the practice of secularism could not be sustained. There were a lot of weaknesses in the practice of secularism, even by Congress, even by other secular parties. And after 1980s, it became more and more difficult to practice secularism. The result was that Muslim community, number one, suffered with insecurity. Number two, now this insecurity has been rising exponentially during last few decades. And number three, what added on to this was America's propping up Al-Qaeda to control the oil in the West Asia, because of which the term Islamic terrorism came to further worsen the situation here. Next slide, please. So today, the Muslim community has mainly the issue of insecurity. Number two, marginalization in economic sections. And number three, a crisis of their identity. Now, Congress, despite being weakly secular, it did appoint a structure committee, which told us that during last 60 years at that time, that all communities have slightly progressed, barring one community, and that is the Muslims. They have no representation in the society here and there, except they are overrepresented in jails. Now, these are the main findings, and today this community has been suffering with all this. And here I must tell you that the issues which were raised by communal forces have been mainly revolved around emotions. They have never been talking of the human rights of Dalits, women, Adivasi workers, forget the religious minorities. So they have been raising this emotive issue. And one illustrative example I'll give you, which is worth remembering. Recently, from 2014, India came forward in two areas. One was increase in the number of lynchings in the name of cow and beef. Number two, it was in India became the front runner in export of beef all over the world. So these two phenomena go on. We see the lynching of Muslims and partly Dalits. And I was wondering whether they are really worried about so much about the cows. Then I went into the depth of this. I found that Swami Vivekananda tells us that in Vedic period, beef was consumed. Professor D.N. Jha's book tells us beef was consumed in Vedic period. Wherever BJP governments have come in the state, they have opened gaushalas and they were such mismanaged that hundreds of cows died because of malnutrition, died because of deprivations, etc., etc. And then when I went to the depth of this, one interesting thing I came across, and that is related to our previous Prime Minister, whom you also can remember as a poet. He was a poet also, he was a Prime Minister also, he was the first Prime Minister of NDA government. I hope you guess the name. So I was reading his biography. He was a thoroughbred RSS Pracharak. And once in his biography, Har Nahi Manunga, Vijay Trivedi tells us that once he was in a lecture tour in US, And when he was in lecture tour in US, after one of the lectures, food was served, and one of the food item which was served was beef. Beef. His neighbor who was sitting next to him said, Atalji, oh, what are they doing? They are serving us beef. Atalji gave a wide smile and said, don't worry, dear. This is not of Indian cow. This is of American cow. Enjoy yourself. So this is the overall issue which the Indian Muslim communities feel, where their rights as citizens, their rights as human beings are under grave threat because of the politics which we have been witnessing. Next slide, please. The second minority, which of course so far has never been so much in forefront, but you can remember that this anti-Christian sentiments started picking up in the decade of 1990s. You'll remember the gruesome murder of Pastor Graham Staines in 1999, along with his two innocent sons, and that was done by a member of Bajrang Dal called Dara Singh, who is in life imprisonment today. The later second one, Kandhamal violence, in which many of us were involved in investigation. Kandhamal violence also saw over 100 deaths and destruction to the property and demolition of many churches in the area. And before this, we had also witnessed in Gujarat, Dangs, there was violence. In Chabua, there was rape of nuns, as many swamis related to VHP. Of course, you by now must be knowing VHP is an integral part of the what they call as Sangh Parivar, associate of RSS, mainly controlled by RSS policies. So some of these swamis set up their ashrams in Adivasi areas in Gujarat, like that was Swami Asimanand. Then followers of Asaram Bapu, they were active in Jhabua, and Swami Lakshmananand, who was active in Kandhamal. They spread anti-Christian sentiments, and I believe that violence does not take place spontaneously. Violence can take place because of the spread of hatred. Violence is not spontaneous, it is orchestrated. Next slide, please. Now, so in Adivasi areas, they started saying that the Christian missionaries are converting the gullible Adivasis, but those people who have gone in and seen that in Adivasi areas, the main problem they face that Christian missionaries have focused in the area of health and education. And these are two processes which have empowered the Adivasis, and empowering of the Adivasis is not acceptable to those sections of society who believe in Hindu nationalism, so to say. Now, so it is in this ground, as such, if we see, the main charge is that Christian missionaries are converting. But let me tell you, Christianity is one of the oldest religion in the country. Not only India, all over the world, if you see, India has been one of the places where Christianity is very old. And some accounts tell us that from AD 52, Saint Thomas came to Malabar coast, and he established a series of churches. So it came here in India in AD 52. Today we are in 2020, and 2011 census tells us, next slide please, 2011 census tells us that in India Christians are 2.3%. So friends, my basic point is that today what we are seeing is of course a violation of human rights of minorities and even violation of their citizenship rights. But basic contradiction is not between religions. It is not Hinduism versus Islam. It is not Hinduism versus Christianity. It is basically, in the name of Hindu nationalism, they want to bring in the values of feudal times in the current area. And that's why the last point I'd like to make, if you want to understand Hindu nationalism and Indian constitution, please try to look at two people. One is K. Sudarshan, who was chief of RSS, and in 2000 he said, Indian constitution is based on the Western values. Throw it away and bring a constitution based on Indian holy books. contrast to this, see Ambedkar. Ambedkar went on to support the burning of Manusmriti, and at that time he must have said, Manusmriti gives the provisions of slavery of Shudras, Dalits and women. I do not accept it, so I support its burning. Same Ambedkar went on to become the chief of drafting committee of India's constitution. So basically, friends, when we are talking of human rights of minorities, essentially we are talking of those UN conventions which believe that rights belong to all of us in the world. When we talk of rights of the minorities, we are re-emphasizing the basic values of Indian Constitution, which believe in liberty, equality, fraternity. Thank you very much for this patient hearing. I hope I have made some point. And as far as references are concerned, you will see that we had a Orissa Tribunal report available on the net. Then Wadhwa Commission report is also on the net. As far as Indian Muslim minority, there is a book by Asghar Ali Engineer in Kalpaz. Lately, Yale University has come up with very good research about Indian Muslims, and there are a lot of material which should be available on, sorry to be talking about my own reference, on my YouTube videos. There is a lot of material on that, on our websites also, websites particularly, these is Wire, Scroll, they carry wonderful material on this thing, and similarly my own website, pluralindia.com, and the website of Tista Setalwad, sabrang.in is a valuable resource for understanding these issues. As Henry pointed out, I should tell you some of the books. Of course, some of my books are private publications, not much by big ones, but still 5-6 books are available on Amazon. I know we are under lockdown. Currently, you can't get the books, but as soon as the lockdown is lifted, some books you can get from Amazon, and some of the books I have to distribute myself because I can't find big publishers to support the publication of small books. Thank you very much. Your questions are welcome.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you very much. I know how embarrassing it is for you, but I had to talk about these books because we have a lot of academics here, and I'm sure there'll be a lot of thirst for good material coming from people like you. And that is the reason I mentioned it. You have given it. We will put all this again, codify it and put it together for the participants to be able to have access to it. Matthew, can you go ahead with the questions, please?
Yes, sure. So thank you, Rampanani ji. There are a couple of questions I would like to select and summarize and ask you.
You're welcome.
One of them is with regard to the current situation, with regard to lockdown and Muslim community being targeted.
Yeah.
What do you think should have been the approach of the government or the larger civil society with regard to it to stop it or restrict it from the day it started?
See, one thing is that to expect that this government will do anything affirmative for religious minorities, I don't believe it will ever do it. I am very clear about it. There are some state governments, we have taken very positive steps, and the shortest answer to your question is that just government should follow the Kerala model. Gujarat model was very famous, then Delhi model came up, and Kerala in practice demonstrated how to take care of weak, marginalized and poorer sections of society. But I have no expectation from this government, but I'm very happy to tell you that there are many NGOs, many social groups who on their own are struggling a lot to reach rations to the not only just the Muslims, poorer sections of society. But of course, there are some things like you declare a lockdown in 4 hours and crores of people want to go back to their home. That I think no private NGO, no social organization can do it. So that at one level, the situation is hopeless. And unless this government wakes up to the plight of the poor, the central point is the plight of poor. Are you sensitive to the poorer sections of society? Muslims apart, Christians apart, today it is a migrant worker, it is a poor Muslim, it is a poor Christian who are sailing in the same boat of suffering. So I hope, I can just appeal, I can just dream that this government wakes up to this plight of migrant workers, gives them one suggestion, I have issued one video on behalf of a group which says that let's tax the 1% super rich of the country who own nearly 70% of wealth. That 1 or 2% being taxed from that can support the needs, so that these poor people can be given 3, 4, 5,000 per month without asking questions. They can be given. Our godowns are loaded with grains. Please reach it to them. Forget economics. Economics is secondary to human life. So this the rich should be taxed. Poor should be given monthly rations. Poor should be given provided transport, safe transport to reach to their houses. I can just hope, dream, and wish that these things happen.
Thank you. I will ask you a couple of questions, and you can merge your responses in the interest of time.
I'll try to.
Few of the participants have asked about conversion, religious conversion. So if you can provide a bit more insight into the issue of conversion in India, the legality and the social context. Three participants have spoken to other minorities than Muslims and Christians, and why they do not feature much in the debates. And the third, my last question, and you can take it from here, is what the entire thing with regard to Minority Morcha of the RSS and others. So if you can speak a bit more about that.
Yeah. See, all these three questions are very good. First thing, as I told you, conversion to Islam took place mainly because of the Varna caste system. And it took place under the influence of the Sufi saints. And that's why you see a large section of Muslims come from the poorer society section. Now, as far as conversion to Christianity is concerned, please note that if a Christian missionary is working in the interior places, which has been neglected by the government for decades, there, if Adivasis come in contact with a nun or a priest who sometimes gives them medicine, sometimes gives them direction, sometimes gives them education, why will they not convert? Why? The question is the other way around. And if you see that India's Christian population is 2.3%. Christianity is 1900 years old and Christians are 2.3%. Muslim kings ruled parts of the country for 700 years. And what is the percentage of Muslims? 14%. So question is, king's role is not there. It is a social urge. It's an emotional urge to get liberated or to have better choice, number one. Number two, as far as this other minorities are concerned, let me tell you, British identified which is the biggest minority so that they can create the division uniformly all over the country. That's why they natural choice was the conflict between Hindus and Muslims, and that's why initially British initiated this Hindu versus Muslim. Now Christians have been added up from decade of 1990s because the base of RSS does not accept empowerment of Adivasis through education, through betterment of health facilities. They don't accept it. That's why they especially set up Vanvasi Kalyan Ashram so that they can work in the Adivasi areas, try to spread hatred against Christians, and try to get in violence. And as far as the third point is concerned, that is a very important point, and that is RSS has been floating organization for Muslims. RSS has been floating organization for Christians. Excellent. What a job. Please note that their ideas are totally opposed to the ideas of Ambedkar. And who is the biggest appreciator superficially of Ambedkar these days? Who's putting the biggest mala, biggest garlands in Ambedkar? That is RSS. They, for electoral reasons, they want these minorities to be with them. And that's why Rashtriya Muslim Manch is one, and for Christians also they are trying to do this. So this is the attempt to win over some elites of those sections and to try to indoctrinate them into believing the ideas of Hindu nationalism. Basically, this is a very clever move. Since they have become powerful, they can come to this extent Now look at Mukhtar Abbas Naqvi. Sorry to be taking one name. He's a Muslim. He's a minister. He said India is like Jannat. Jannat, of course, you must be knowing, no? Equivalent of Swarg or heaven. India is like Jannat for Muslims. I am surprised at whether it is a Jannat or Jahannam, Swarg or Narak. That is a very eternal concept. So when Mukhtar Abbas Naqvi says that, you know how RSS can brainwash certain sections of society to achieve its goal of coming to power and to impose Hindu nationalism on the country.
Thank you, Professor. Henry, you can come in now.
Thank you.
Henry, you're on mute.
I would only say something which I always say, and I'm sure Professor doesn't worry about us saying this. Academic institutions. This is one professor you should be inviting for courses on communal harmony. And there will be very, very carefully charted out courses according to the time frame you are able to provide him, for him to be able to travel to your institution and do these courses. It is nothing like listening to him patiently for hours together on the way he's able to talk about history, but then in a very convincing manner, because we need this very badly at this hour. And that was the purpose why we wanted to introduce Professor Ram Punyani in this course. I want to apologize to him, as I already did when I invited him. 30 minutes is not being respectful to him, but it was a 30 minutes for introducing him. And I am sure people here will further on their research, go on to his YouTube channels, look at the booklets that are already available, and we will also try to see in consultation with him how we can make these details of all these publications available, because that is what is really necessary. So thank you, Professor. Thank you very much for accepting.
Thank you, Henry. Thank you, Henry. Thank you, friends. It was a pleasure talking to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. And we are trying to see in the next module also that Professor is able to come on a longer framework.
Sure. I'll be there.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Now, friends, we go to the second part of this afternoon session. I am told, yes, I'm told Mihir Desai, he appears just like that. Two of them from Mumbai, both of them waving to each other. I'm sure they are in very difficult situations there. Both good friends to each other, and therefore,
of course,
very good. Happy to
you guessed it right.
So we want to welcome into your midst Professor Mihir Desai, not Professor.
Advocate.
He will bash me if I call him a professor. This is the problem when you have very good friends in the audience and in the list of people. 1 second. I want to make sure that I get your Mihir is an activist. Basically, he's an activist. He comes out as a lawyer from having, and I'll use a word very respectfully, dirtying his hands with labor issues in Mumbai. That is where he comes from. Mihir is a human rights lawyer who works in cases of mass murder and riots. It's going to be a little tough, huh? Fake encounter and custodial deaths by the police brutality, freedom of speech and journalists, political activists, and prisoners of conscience, excesses by the state, mass disappearances, and deaths and genocide probes. That's a tough job for lawyers to undertake. He is a designated senior counsel. Not that he is old in age. It's a designation that is given by the full bench of the Bombay High Court. So he's a designated senior counsel and has been practicing largely on the criminal matters in the High Court of Mumbai and as well as in the Supreme Court of India. He's the co-founder of the Human Rights Law Network and the India People's Tribunal, which are two very famous initiatives that Mihir was engaged in. And I want to tell you something more. There was one case in Gujarat High Court, which was initiated by our very good friend, but we don't need to get into who did it, which was trying to implicate the present Prime Minister in the Gujarat riots. That entire case was argued before the courts at different stages by Mr. Mihir Desai. You have now got a taste of who this Mihir Desai is. I'm extremely happy that he has accepted to be here. Very difficult person to get because of the work at hand, and today courts are working, although it is online. And therefore I thank Mihir for having accepted to be here, and I invite him to speak something which is, I'm sure, very passionate to him, which is labor rights are human rights. Over to you, Mihir.
Thanks a lot, Henry. I hope you can hear me.
Perfect.
Okay, fine. Wonderful. Okay, so thanks a lot, Henry, for that. Labor rights, the issue of labor rights, the labor laws, the labor jurisprudence is so vast, actually, that it's very difficult to even even begin to talk about it in the time constraint which we all have here. But so let me pick up 2 or 3 issues which I feel are very important, which we always need to keep in mind when we are talking about labor law. First is I'll talk about 5 main concerns about the jurisprudence of labor rights. That's one thing, and how they become, how they are seen as human rights. Second thing, briefly about the development of the labor law in India, and thirdly about the recent changes which a few of the state governments is trying to bring about to the labor laws under the guise that right now there is economic crisis, etc., etc. So let me start by talking about the first issue. Now remember one thing. In the 19th century and even in the early 20th century, it was believed that when people are contracting with each other, they enter the market as free and equal individuals, offering their product to the buyer at a rate which the buyer is free to either accept or reject. If I'm selling you my flat, I show you my flat, I tell you, okay, I'm selling it for 20 lakhs. It's for you to decide yes or no. You're most welcome to decide no, you're most welcome to decide yes and enter into a contract with me, or not to enter into a contract with me. This is the same. Labor market was seen in a similar way. That the management can tell me, if management can say that, look, I have a job for you. We come together in the labor market. The management tells me that I have a job for you. I am going to offer you 100 rupees per month. I'm just giving you an example. 100 rupees per month. If you want to accept it, accept it. If you don't want to accept it, reject it. Okay. You are a free individual as a laborer to enter into a contract with me or not to enter into a contract with me. You are also a free individual either to accept the term which I am offering or not to accept the term which I am offering. So both of us are equal free individuals in the market of labor, and we decide whether we want to enter into a contract or not. Okay. And the laws were basically, I mean, there were no labor laws, but basically it was a law of contract which operated. And if I do that, I mean, if I want to enter into a contract, I do. If I don't want to enter into a contract, I don't. Okay. It was subsequently, partly because of the labor struggle for 8-hour working day, etc., that the governments and some of the courts started recognizing that management and labor do not come into the marketplace as equals. They come as unequals, and inequality is loaded tremendously against the workers. because workers have no choice but to accept. They have the choice of either taking unemployment or taking what they get. So the choice, so it's hardly any free choice which they are exercising in a situation of like what was existing at that time, what is existing even today. Okay. So the government started recognizing that yes, the state started recognizing that yes, there is an inequality, and because there is an inequality, you can't treat the contract as a free contract, and therefore the state has to step in, okay, by providing legislation to protect and neutralize this inequality. That is how initially the labor law started getting formed. Whether it was an 8-hour working day or whether it was something else, that was one thing. The second point, okay, was that it was also realized that ordinarily two individuals contract with each other and they are supposed to be equal in the free market. But here it was realized that an individual worker, okay, is in no position of equality with the individual employer. And the only way in which the individual worker can exercise the freedom of choice is if there is collective bargaining. That is, workers as a whole and not individually are allowed to negotiate, okay, with the managements, and only then there can be some semblance of equality. And therefore you had from that time onwards the development of what is known as collective bargaining. And with it, of course, you had in 1926 in India for the first time the Trade Unions Act, which allowed workers to form trade unions. That was the second thing. The third principle, okay, which was earlier accepted and then later on rejected. The third principle was that if you are entering into a contract and accepting to abide by the terms of contract, then you are presumed to be accepting the risks which are involved in executing the contract. So if I'm a worker and I agree to work in a mine, okay, and the mine caves in, okay, then I am presumed to have accepted the risk that if I agree to work in a mine as a free individual, my mine might cave in, nobody's fault. That was how it was looked at. This was changed also in the 20s, and then just post independence, where an Employers' Liability Act was passed in 20s, which said basically that a worker is not presumed to accept the risks involved in the employment. So if the mine caves in, the employer will be liable to compensate him. Okay? Similarly, under the Factories Act, which came in 1948, it was provided that the management is required to provide drinking water, urinals, safety equipment, health provisions, first aid kits, etc., at the factories, in the factory itself. Okay. So this was the third issue of jurisprudence. The fourth issue of jurisprudence is that ordinarily, if you treat an employment contract as a normal contract, okay, then when that contract is breached, okay, the normal remedy for a breach of contract is to go to the civil court and ask for compensation, ask for whatever relief you can get in the civil court. Here, with the beginning of the labor laws in India, especially post-independence, the government realized, or the state realized, that it is not good enough to ask workers if there is a breach of contract. Suppose you are terminated. Suppose your salary is reduced. Suppose you are not promoted. Okay, it is not good enough to ask you to go to the civil court, because civil court will be of very limited importance, and therefore it is important to set up an independent judicial mechanism. Okay, that is what has come to know as industrial court, labor court, etc., etc. So set up an independent. Don't drive the workers to the civil courts, but set up independent mechanisms. So you have the Industrial Disputes Act. You have then various state laws, Industrial Relations Act, etc., which set out the machinery which can be accessed, the remedy which can be used by the workers. And finally, yeah, under the normal contract law, okay, a contract for personal service can never be specifically enforced. So if I enter into a contract with you, saying that you should do some carpentry work. You are an independent contractor, independent carpenter, or independent architect, and I tell you that you do the interior designs of my house. Okay, it's a normal contract. Suppose we enter into a written contract. Then what happens is that if you do not complete your part of the contract, I cannot go to the court and say that you must complete the part of the contract. I can go to the court and say that ask him to pay me damages, but I cannot go to court and say that you must perform the part of your contract. That is called specific performance. That is called specific performance of personal service contracts. So that is not something permissible under the normal contract law. Under the industrial legislation and labor legislation, they changed that also. And they said that no, under service law and labor law, okay, contracts of personal service can also be specifically enforced. What does it mean? Suppose my services are, I am a permanent employee, my services are terminated. Okay? Under ordinary contract law, I can only go to court and say, give me damages. But under the industrial law, I can go to court and say that no, direct the management to specifically enforce the contract by taking me back on the job. Okay, allow me to work and pay me my salary. So these are the 5 issues, okay, of jurisprudence in terms of labor jurisprudence, which in a sense deviated from the normal contract jurisprudence. And it was on the basis of A, huge struggles by the working class, B, many of the states recognizing on the basis of the struggles that their working class needs to be protected. See the whole dawn of what we know as a welfare state, etc. That this shift in the jurisprudence takes place. This takes place in the 20th century, beginning of 20th century, and continues. Now, if you see the Constitution of India, okay, when the main foundation of the laws which come in, okay, the Constitution of India. The Constitution of India, if you see the fundamental rights chapter, mainly fundamental rights are available against the state. Okay? That if you have a fundamental right, it can be enforced against the state. It's not about private parties, it's about state. But there are 3 or 4 fundamental rights which are available also against private parties. Okay. So, and 2 of those fundamental rights which are available against private parties are also labor rights. The first is Article 23, which basically talks about forced labor. Okay. That forced labor cannot be is something which cannot be permitted under India. It's a fundamental right not to be allowed to force to labor. That is what they call begar is something which is not allowed. So that is a fundamental right. The forced labor is banned as a fundamental right. Similarly, Article 24 talks about the children who are less than 14 years of age not to be allowed to work in hazardous factories, hazardous mines, etc., etc. Now, this again applies across the board, not just vis-a-vis state enterprises, but any enterprises. Okay, cannot ask children below 14 to work. And that's a part of the fundamental right. Similarly, one other fundamental right which is important, of course, from the point of view of workers' right, is Article 19(1)(c), which permits workers to form unions as a fundamental right. Okay? And this all came through the Constitution. Apart from that, of course, the directive principles of state policy. You had various directive principles such as equal pay should be there, then just and human conditions of work should be there, living wages should be paid, participation by workers in management should be encouraged, right to work itself as a directive principle. So all these factors, okay, were brought in through the Constitution in 1950. But even before the Constitution came in, some of the major labor laws were brought in the 40s. That was the first phase when some of the major laws were brought in. In the first phase, the major laws which were brought in were, of course, the Industrial Disputes Act, which provides a mechanism for employees to approach courts, to approach tribunals, to approach the labor commissioner, and say that I want to say that this is the grievance, I want this grievance to be settled, or to collectively bargain with the management, enter into settlement with the management, which would be binding on everybody for a particular number of years. Management cannot renege from it, etc. So that was Industrial Disputes Act. The second act which was brought in at that point of time was, of course, Factories Act. which provides for safe working conditions, health, safety, basic cleanliness, hygiene, etc. at the working place. So that was the second thing. There were a couple of other acts which I won't go into all because there are a number of, and all these are central acts. Okay, all these, the state governments, various state governments have also passed from time to time acts for protection of certain kind of workers, etc. But I won't really get into it because the time is a little short. The other thing which happened, and then you have the whole question of health of workers through what is known as ESI Act, Employee State Insurance Act. You had the long-term security of workmen through the Employees Provident Fund Act. These came in the 40s and 50s. Okay. Apart from these normal, then you have the Employment Standing Orders Act, which provides for what should be the terms and conditions of workers when they are working. If you want to take action against a worker, what is the procedure? What are the misconduct, defining misconduct, etc., etc. These were some of the other laws which were brought in. What is also important to notice is that in the respect of various special categories, over the period of last 40 to 50 years, a number of labor legislations have been brought in. Like, for instance, if you see women, you had the Equal Remuneration Act, the Maternity Benefit Act, the Sexual Harassment Act. Then for contract labor, you had a separate legislation. For construction workers, separate legislation. For bonded labor, separate legislation. Migrant workers, which we are talking about right now so much in the COVID situation. Migrant workers, there is separate legislation. Unorganized workers, there is a separate legislation. Child labor, there is a separate legislation. BD workers separate. Mine workers separate. Dock workers separate. Street vendors separate. So you had separate legislations for all these kind of categories of workmen. And over a period of last 40-50 years, the number of legislation at the central level has increased. Okay? That is one thing. The problem is that most of these legislations, there are two problems with many of these legislations. One is some of these legislations do not apply to unorganized sector. Or do not, for instance, if it's a Factories Act or Provident Fund Act, it will apply only to an establishment which is less than 10 or 20 workers, more than 10 or 20 workers, and not otherwise. Okay? It will apply only to people who are defined as workmen. Okay? And workmen's definition is very narrow. Okay? So many of these legislation, like the Employment Standing Orders Act, will not apply unless you have at least 50 employees working in the workplace. So if there are less than 50 workers, then you don't have that law applicable to you. So what happens because of this is that a large number of these laws, okay, do not apply to those except the workers whom we conventionally call organized sector workers. Okay? So they do not apply to them. So while there are laws, their applicability is very limited by the nature of the laws only. So that's one aspect. The second aspect, which is very important to keep in mind, is the complete failure of the government, of the state, and also of the employers to implement these laws. Just to give an example, I mean, this is an example which is right from now, that under the Migrant Workers Act, every migrant worker has to be registered in the state to which that person migrates, to the place where that person is working. If this was actually implemented, and this act is about 40 years old, 35 years back, this act was passed. If this act was actually implemented, you would have had with each state government a list of migrant workers, where they are working, where they are staying, etc., etc. But it's a complete failure to implement this law, that you do not have the migrant workers, any kind of list of migrant workers with any state governments or the central government. Similarly is the situation with many laws, which like for instance Child Labor Act. Okay, I mean, you see so many child labor working in various kinds of establishments all across the country, whether it's restaurants, whether it's in different kinds of brick kilns, whether you see in BD workers and home-based BD workers, etc. You have a lot of child labor. Similarly, if you see the Manual Scavengers Act, okay, which abolish manual scavenging. Okay? But if you look at its implementation, the implementation is very, very lackadaisical. Now, it would be lackadaisical because of the kind of state apathy to these laws, because a lot of these laws are passed for populist purpose, not because they were ever to be implemented. So that's one thing we must bear in mind. So when today people are saying that we need to change the laws because otherwise industries will not come here, something like that, I think that's a complete sham. Because the labor laws by and large apply to only to about 10 or 15% of the labor force in the country, and even for those 10 or 15% of the workers, it's something which is not implemented at all, okay, or very hardly implemented. I mean, of course, one must defend the labor laws because at least it gives some kind of protection to workers, etc. But to say that because of the functioning of the operation of these labor laws, industries are not coming is really, I mean, one sees. When I started practice, I just give you an anecdotal example. When I started practice, I started my practice in labor courts in Bombay, and at that time, labor courts were thriving. You had every day lots of laborers coming, unions coming, lawyers arguing, unionists arguing, arguments about charter of demands, arguments about various other issues. If you go today to the labor courts in Mumbai, you will hardly see any face there. I mean, this is the thing. The only issues which are now being tried are, say, termination matters, etc., which are individual termination cases. That's all. Because labor courts themselves take a lot of time, industrial courts take a lot of time. Then if the management loses, they can drag you up to Supreme Court. Workers can't afford it. So all those kind of problems are there in terms of actual implementation of labor laws, and therefore, despite the fact that there is, at least on paper, an attempt to neutralize the inequality in the marketplace between labor and management, that inequality has not at all been neutralized. You have the abolition of bonded labor act since last so many years, and you still have bonded laborers. Okay, you still have contract laborers, despite the fact that contract laborers are supposed to be very highly protected under the Contract Workers Act. So you have a situation whereby the implementation of the labor laws in India is pathetic. It's very bad. In that context, I just want to come a little bit to the third issue, which is the present changes which some of the state governments are trying to bring. Now, if you see in the last 15 days or so, a number of governments, at least about 7 state governments, and this cuts across party lines, it's BJP states as well as Congress states, okay, at least about 7 states have said that they are going to dilute the labor laws at least for some time in order for industry to survive. Okay, that is what they are doing. Now, what are they diluting? In most of the places, what they are diluting is the hours of work. Because remember that it was in the 19th century, after huge struggles across the world, that workers won the right of 8 hours working day. Okay? Well, earlier they were asked to work for 14 hours, 16 hours, 18 hours, whatever. People used to die at workplace just by exhaustion. So they won the right to 8 hours working day, and this was incorporated in the Factories Act also. Okay? Now what they are saying is, no, not 8 hours working day. We'll have 12 hours working day. We'll have 12 hours working day. The working week was supposed to be 48 hours maximum. Now they are increasing it to 72 hours. Okay, that's one thing which they are doing. The second thing which is happening, especially if you see the MP, UP, and Gujarat models, which they say that they are following, they are saying that for a period of about 3 years, okay, we are going to suspend the majority of the labor laws, okay, except, for instance, Bonded Labor Act, which anyway doesn't get implemented. Minimum Wages Act, where the minimum wages are very, very, very low anyway. Some laws concerning women and children. So, and the provision of the Payment of Wages Act, which says that your wages have to be paid on a particular date. So, apart from this, we are going to suspend all the labor laws. Now, I personally feel constitutionally it is not possible for them to do so. So it might be challenged in courts, but looking at the way the courts are behaving right now, I don't know what the courts will do. Okay, but that's a separate aspect. But look at the situation. What it means. Suppose Factories Act is suspended, or it is being suspended now. What does it mean? It means that you cannot, okay, demand that there should be drinking water in the factory side, though my working hours have now gone to 12 hours. You cannot demand that there should be a urinal at the factory side, though my working hours are now going to be 12 hours. or even for 8 hours you need it, but I'm just saying. So it's a kind of it's a play with workers. I mean, look at what happened in Visakhapatnam. When with the Factories Act, you had this kind of an gas leakage and people dying. Just imagine that if Factories Act is not there, okay, when no safety measures are required to be taken by the employers, how many more deaths will take place? How many more? How unsafe will be the environment? Before they, how unsafe will be the environment for working? So what is happening is that under the pretext of COVID, under the pretext of the present health emergency, the governments and the central government, state governments and the central government are trying to squeeze in laws, okay, which otherwise it will be impermissible for them to do. Okay? So they are changing environmental laws. They are making changes in environmental laws. They are making changes in criminal law. Of course, changes they've already made and they'll again make. And remember one thing, with the mass unemployment which has been generated by COVID itself has generated a mass unemployment. With that kind of a mass unemployment, what is going to happen is the bargaining strength of the workers is still going to be low. It's going to be lower. Okay? Coupled with the fact that if they actually implement this NRC and CAA, you will have a huge population of rightless people, rightless workers, okay, who will be around, apart from the fact that there are no labor laws. So you will have millions and millions of workers who have no bargaining strength of any kind, okay, no protection of law of any kind, okay, forced to work virtually as bonded laborers, under the guise that our economy needs to be rebuilt. Now remember one thing, even from an economic point of view, this doesn't make any sense, because from an economic point of view, unless there is an effective demand, unless people have money to buy things, your economy can never revive. And if you are going to take away money from people's hands and ask them, okay, to now, and ask them to take away the money on the ground that we want to revive the economy, that's really a ridiculous kind of an argument, because because if you are 70% of the people or 60% of the people do not have any money to buy goods which you are manufacturing, your economy is never going to be revived. So these are the 3 points which I thought I'll make, and then if there are any questions, I will take them. Thank you very much, Hani, and thank you all of you.
Thank you, Meher. I've tried to collect a few questions.
Yeah.
There are 2 specifically. One just came, maybe I can ask later. The 2 questions are, can forming the trade unions in all unorganized sector help them to have proper wages, as most of the work is managed by contractors? Here the participant is asking with regard to forming trade unions among the unorganized sector.
Right.
And the second question is, like in your talk, you have referred to several laws and stated that they are not implemented well or are redundant. What, according to you, are the reasons for the same, and why workers themselves could not get them implemented?
Okay. Should I answer?
Yes.
Yeah. See, as far as formation of trade unions, I personally feel formation of any kind of collective organization, okay, is the only answer, okay, to non-implementation of laws or better implementation of laws, etc., or better bargaining strength. Okay? So whether by itself, if you see the percentage of unionized workforce, okay, even in USA, for instance, the percentage of unionized workforce is around 12%. Okay, in India it is even lesser. Okay, unionized workforce. So you don't have that many unions. You have unions in public sector undertakings, etc., quite a lot. In big private companies, you have trade unions, but in smaller companies, okay, while there have been various attempts made, and the attempts keep on happening, okay, the attempts sometimes have failed, sometimes have succeeded. But I personally feel that apart from trade unions, apart from organizing yourself, okay, whether you call it trade union, whether you call it association, whatever you call it, but unless the workers themselves organize and collectively raise their demands, collectively agitate, collectively talk about their working conditions, okay, the working conditions are not going to change. Whatever has happened up till now, okay, whether it was in the late 19th century across Europe and USA, or whether it was in the 20th century, middle of 20th century, I will leave it later on in India, has happened because the working class was unionized, or a section of them at least was unionized, and they were agitating. It is the need of the hour, according to me, that trade unions should be formed, and trade unions, whether it's not an easy task, it's a very, very difficult task, but I don't see any substitute for it. What is the substitute? You file some PIL, or you file some court case or something like that. That's the only substitute. It doesn't work. It may work in a case here, a case there, but in terms of long-term this thing, it doesn't work. The second question, I think I partly answered when I was talking about that. Why are these laws not working? The laws are not working because, again, the same thing that for law, say for instance, a Factories Act to work effectively, you need workers you need two things. One is you need the factory inspectorate, okay, because you have under the Factories Act factory inspectors who are supposed to make surprise visits to factories, inspect those factories, find out whether they are complying with the law or not, etc. Now, the only place many of these factory inspectors visit are the hotels where they meet the employers, take the packet and go home. Okay, that's a reality. Okay? So the inspectorate has completely failed, at least in many parts. In some parts, it has been doing some work. There are, of course, individual very good inspectors, etc. But that is one thing. So the state supervision over whether a Factories Act is working or not has failed completely. And the demand should be, how do you make it active, make it accountable? And second thing is, it becomes important also for the workers to raise the issues that this is not being implemented. Because if you see on paper, the labor laws are very, very good. Okay, on paper. Okay, so if they were actually implemented, fully implemented, then a large proportion of the problems which we see today would not be there. So it also happens that workers will have to raise these demands. Now again, the workers, in order to raise the demand, an individual worker will not be able to raise it. That individual will be victimized. We have seen it across the board. That if an individual raises some demand, without taking the collective voice of the workers into account, that person will be victimized, will be thrown out. Okay? So individuals are very scared. So again, it becomes the role of trade unions or some kind of collective formation which raises, or sometimes from outside. Okay, sometimes persons who are not working there, but from a civil society organization who can raise these issues. So it becomes important for these, and therefore, while the laws are not implemented, I think the resistance to the non-implementation law has to be also strong. Otherwise, they will never be implemented. That's what I think.
Thank you. Just a couple of more. We have little time left.
Yeah.
One is with regard to children in the workforce. Like, children are in workforce in various spaces.
Yes.
And do they also have the fundamental right to associate and form their unions?
Well, yes. Yeah. Any other question you wanted me to ask?
Very small. You spoke about laws being not implemented. Now, what prevents the government, you think, from enforcing such laws? And one participant would like to ask labor laws or union formation in the multinational corporations. There are some restrictions in some MNCs. That's all.
Okay. See, as far as children are concerned, yes, of course, they can organize together. Okay, they can organize, they can form, or they can join some union, etc., etc. But what happens is that under the Trade Union Act, there is an age limit. Unless you are 18 years of age, you can't join it. But associations can be formed. Some outside organ. But remember one thing: the children who are actually working, okay, are the most vulnerable of all the sections. Okay, though they are children, they are not in school. They are not at home. They're not with their families. They are actually going and working, which itself reflects on the fact that they don't have any bargaining strength. They don't have any choice what to work. And it's very difficult for us to assume that they will actually go around organizing. And that's where the civil society organizations have to play a role. So that's one aspect. As far as the why is the government not implementing the laws? Where I personally think the government doesn't pass these laws in order to implement them. Government passes these laws in order to tell the international fora that, look, we have done our duty under the ILO, tell the ILO we have done this duty, tell some other United Nations organizations that we have performed our duty by passing these laws, etc. They have no intention of, implementing majority of the laws unless there is a protest which is widespread. Okay? So that's one thing. But remember one thing, that ultimately the managements are opposed to these kind of laws. They would like a complete jungle raj. Okay, and they are the ones who are paying the parties, political parties, etc., etc. The funds, not the workers, are not paying those funds. So these are the people who are paying the funds in order for elections and for various other purposes. Okay, whether it's political bonds or whatever. This, the third thing is the third question is about multinationals. Okay. You see, what has been happening is it's not that in multinationals you can't form unions, but it is that in some of the areas like the SCZs, which have been complete failure, of course, in India, the special economic zones, okay? And in some other areas, see, each of these act also provides that under certain conditions, this act will not be operated. Okay. And they use this kind of provisions, like the same thing they are doing with Factories Act. Factories Act says that, and there is Section 5, that in times of emergency, you can suspend the provisions of this act. So they use this Section 5 to suspend provision. What they forget is Section 5 talks about an external aggression or an internal challenge to the security of the state. There is no challenge to the security of state today. Okay, there might be an epidemic, but it's not challenge to the security of the state. But even then, they'll use that kind of a law to provision to suspend the laws. So this is what has been happening. So I personally feel that, and you see, multinationals, not just what happens is that the nature of workforce has changed over the years, over the decades. The nature of workforce has changed. Like, for instance, in India, it's less. I mean, earlier you had much more of an organized workforce, big factories working, big unions operating. That has changed completely. You have a lot of big service sector. You have multinationals. You have operations which can be done from abroad without ever having to step into India. So but I also feel that a large number of unions, okay, have not adopted to the changing nature of reality. The manner of unionization will have to be different. The kind of issues which you raise vis-a-vis unions will have to be different. Okay, so that change which also the trade unions need to bring has not happened as much as it should. And I hope everybody learns from this changing scenario which is happening. And there are new challenges, and for new challenges you need new kinds of strategies and tactics. And those are not yet coming about, and one hopes that they will come about.
Thank you, Mir. Henry, you can come in now.
Thank you, Matthew. I hope I'm audible.
Yes.
Friends, some of you must be wondering, usually people stop a session on human rights with women's rights, Dalit rights, child rights, tribal rights, etc. And we have now moved on to labor rights, minority rights, environmental rights, right to love, which is coming tomorrow, housing rights, freedom of expression, freedom of association, etc., etc. And in this context, I wanted to recall something that I had witnessed in one of the sessions of the Human Rights Council a year ago. The special rapporteur on freedom of association and assembly, Mr. Mainakia from Kenya, an activist, lawyer himself, somebody who had always told me, Henry, I want to be in Kudangulam, seeing those 20,000 women protesting. I want to be in Orissa with the protests that are taking place. And I looked at him and I said, Maina, I understand, but please don't ever venture and come here. Because if you come or you send any of your African comrades here, the leaders of the movement will have greater pressure because there are foreigners watching the struggle. This man, who was handling the subject of freedom of association and assembly, had, during his reports to the United Nations, made some very strong comments about how labor rights are not considered human rights. So many years after so much of work had been done by ILO in this regard. And during his last session in the Human Rights Council, he had an open event, and I was overwhelmed to see the whole hall was overflowing with people. You don't have side events where all the chairs are taken and there are people standing, etc. Somebody there saying, "Who are all these people? Yeah, what is the reason for so many people coming?" And somebody told me, he has attracted the entire ILO staff here into this hall because he is the one who has reminded the human rights community that labor rights are human rights. And this is exactly what Mihir is doing today, and what is happening in Madhya Pradesh, Gujarat, UP, and other states in terms of labor laws is reminding us that labor laws are human rights, and therefore labor union leaders are human rights defenders, as we saw it this morning. And therefore there's a reason for us all to join together and work. So thank you, Mihir, for trying to do something which only you can do. Putting history, a historical perspective, the present labor law implementation stage, and the present crisis that we are in terms of labor law, with the modifications that have taken place with the codes, as well as a reference to what is happening in some of the states. Thank you very, very much. We will continue to see whether there are questions that have come, and if there are questions, I'm sure you will allow us to disturb you in between with a few more questions. Thank you very much for being with us.
Thanks a lot. Thanks for everybody.
Great joy for all of us. Friends, we will go to a little bit of logistics. I will go back to my slide. Okay, today's activities. Friends, don't get tense when you see activities. As I told you, these activities are there for you to do at your own pace. If the facilitators remind you in your groups, it is not because we are wanting to put pressure on you. You know this is a voluntary activity, except the Right to Information Act activity of yesterday. 8.1 today, and there's nothing much, so don't be scared. There's only one activity. Kindly visit the websites of the following organizations, which work exclusively for human rights defenders, or as a part of their activities work on the issue of human rights defenders. And we have given you the names of a few organizations. In this slide, you have Frontline Defenders, the Observatory of OMCT, Forum Asia, FIDH, ESCR Net, Eastern Horn Africa Human Rights Defenders Program, Protection International, Reporters Without Borders, EMF HRF, and ILGA. What have you to do? They are fantastic websites. Please visit these websites. Try to find out, after going through the websites, what are the special programs each of these organizations have to protect human rights defenders. Kindly only list out the names of only 3 organizations. From the listed many, select only 3 for your work, and name, by listing out, the activities that each of the organizations carry out to protect human rights defenders. What is it that they do as per their website? 3 organizations. Friends, there are a number of activities that they perform, but you will have to pick up 3 organizations and list out all the activities that they perform. Can you name at least 10 human rights defenders by name whose personal cases have been taken up by these organizations for the violations of human rights that they have individually suffered? So when you look at the list of cases that they have handled, you will be able to see the Indian cases. Look at for 2020, 2019, then go to 2018 to get your 10 cases and list out the names of those people whose personal cases. We want only the names of the defenders, but of course you will read what their cases are. Now this is a simple activity that you have in your cup for today. That is the first part. Facilitators are asked to remind them about this. This will be sent or has already been sent to the facilitators and to the groups. So let them read about it and then carry it out in their at home today and then report slowly to you whenever they are finished. The second announcement is about a Google Drive that our friends have prepared for you. All resource materials and presentations until today are available in a Google Drive. Our team has compiled all the resource materials and presentations until today in the drive. The link of the same will be sent to all of you to access the materials. And our office will continue to share the presentations and reading materials on WhatsApp and email. And if there are multiple materials in the same day, we will upload them in the Google Drive and inform you with the link. So the present situation of sending you the materials by WhatsApp and email will continue, but it will also be uploaded on the Google Drive where it will be safely kept and you can access it whenever you want. I hope that is clear. That is point number 2. Point number 3 is about the facilitators. I want to tell the facilitators, please share the attendance to the participants. We are not a university classroom or a college classroom. We might make mistakes at our side. And we want to make sure that the mistakes are immediately corrected. You don't correct the first day's attendance today. So please, let us know. On Saturday, we had 23 absentees. I was quite surprised about it. Monday morning, this morning, we had 20 and 23. This afternoon, we have 17 and 18 in the last session. So in case we have made a mistake, the list is coming to you. You all know that. Present it in your group and get us the feedback so that your verification and we can make corrections here. We don't want it to be done without this exercise in transparency. Now, friends, I have to move